So, good evening, and thanks for coming out to another one of our Rojan Writers talks, this time with John Wiswell, who has a new, I don't know what genre you want to call it, fantasy, science fiction, I don't know what, he'll tell us, I guess. Writer who's been getting a lot of press, and so I'm very interested to hear about the book and your process of writing, and I'm going to just turn it over to you to give us more information. We will have time for questions at the end, and I will be checking the chat for those of you online, so you can just post your questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I am just ever so happy to be here. I have enjoyed this library so much ever since I moved into the area. I really love libraries in general since I was a little kid and my mom took me to our local one and I ran downstairs into the children's area and pulled a book off a shelf that was entirely about plesiosaurs, which, if you're not a dinosaur obsessive, is basically a brontosaurus that lives in the water and bites other animals, which is, to a small child, the coolest thing to ever exist. And I think I was stuck on libraries ever since, because they have books in them about things that bite other things, which is just the best thing a little boy could ask for. And I love this library in particular, because the year after we moved in, there was a terrific ice storm. We lost power for something like 8 days. And this is one of the only places you could come where people would treat you like a person. You could get warm, you could check the internet. And everybody just cared so much about the entire community, reminding me of the power of libraries. So I'm so happy to be here. And also, I'd say after that, friend of mine and library genius, Fran Colombo has just walked in.
Sorry, I'm late.
Who is the next part of the story, actually, because when I started to have the ability to give a little back to the community, one of the first things I did was fix up this computer and then try to give it to a family in need. And Fran was the one right here at the library who was able to help me find that family. Which is, again, speaks to like how much the Rojan Library cares about community. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And yeah, I've been visiting here for years just as a patron. I'm a wide reader and I've been writing short fiction for years. My first novel just came out in April. It came out from Daw Books in the United States, Porcus Books in the United Kingdom. It'll be coming out from Neon Books in Italy in November. There might be a couple more announcements about other countries later. But it's been an amazing reception. The book is called Someone You Can Build a Nest In. It is a fantasy novel from the point of view of the monster. And as our friend was saying earlier, it's a little bit difficult to categorize by a genre. It is a novel about a shape-shifting horror named Shesheshen. She is sort of the regional monster of her isthmus. She's sort of the Medusa or the Dracula. The one thing that isthmus is famous for is that shape-shifting monster that'll eat you if you get too close to it. She has never particularly liked human beings because they have hunted her since she was born. She has hunted them back, but she thinks that's only fair. One night, she is driven out of her lair by some brave monster hunters, and she's poisoned and driven off of a cliff. And she thinks this is how it ends. Humans have killed me. But instead, she is rescued by the least likely savior, a human, Homily. It's this sweet, wholesome lady who mistakes Shesheshen for a fellow human need. So just takes her in and nourishes her, tends to her wounds. And Shesheshen at first is like, well, I need to eat this person immediately to be safe. But the longer they spend together, the less she could imagine doing any sort of violence to this person. This is the one person she's ever met who treats her like she matters. She's someone who might actually understand. And so they start getting closer and closer together and wonder if this could be something special. And Shesheshen does not know how to do love at all. But she knows that keeping a secret is keeping them further apart, and the closer they get, the harder it is for Shesheshen to hide this from Homily. And so she sits her down and she's about to reveal to her that actually I'm a shape-shifting monster when Homily reveals why she's in the isthmus. See, she's hunting this horrible shape-shifting monster. Has Shesheshen seen it anywhere? And that's the premise upon which my little book is. It's a classic love story. I was at the dentist and she asked what it was about. And as I explained that to her, she stuck a hook in my mouth and said, man, that's love, right? that is the kind of book criticism I go to the dentist for myself. So it's been a very funny ride, and this book has been positively reviewed in the Washington Post, the Financial Times, Kirkus, Publishing Weekly, The Guardian, among a lot of other amazing outlets. There's a lovely review in the Library Journal. And one of the funny things, as reviews have come in, is to collect all of the different genres people say this book is, which is why I just smiled before when you were bringing up how do we categorize it. And I had to bring a list because it has been called a fantasy, humorous fantasy, cozy fantasy, dark fantasy, grimdark fantasy, romantasy, and romantic fantasy, which fans of those two things do not like each other or something. There's some weird not overlap there. Straight romance, dark romance, romantic horror, straight up horror, and my favorite, cozy horror. That's the best. And in hindsight, obviously, the genre of book I wrote is platypus. I wrote a thing that people have very personal reactions to. And I think I've almost done my job by baffling marketers that people come away from the book with very personal take on the bond between Homily and Shesheshen and the struggle to maintain your identity while needing to connect with others. And different elements of the book wind up being emphasized to different readers from that. And that's a magical experience. I honestly would not trade that for a single genre. So, and when I get asked what the book is, I mean, firstly, I just wrote it in sort of a secular fashion. It was just like, this book is just Shesheshen's story and Homily's story. And I set out to write a novel that would do justice to two characters, not just one. Often in my short fiction, it's about doing justice to one character's arc. Here we have two characters who have a lot more than the other things, and their contexts unfold. And I wanted that dance of character development, of the push and pull, give and take of a relationship that has this dangerous buried secret at the center, to use it as a scaffold on which these two characters could climb up and reveal like everything that's inside of them, not just first impressions. That a big shock for a lot of the readers is that Homily isn't just like a magical perfect girl. Because at first she is just a giving person. And you think like, oh yes, like in fiction, the nice person has just never suffered or has done suffering. And often we overlook that in our lives, the people who are bravest or kindest or look out most for communities have struggled themselves and are looking out for other people who are less fortunate, that kindness comes from experience. And then Homily is carrying a lot of things from her past that make her this way, that Shesheshen might even want to protect her from. While obviously needing to protect herself from her girlfriend and her finding out that I'm this thing you're here to slay. And so that was the core of writing someone you could build a nest in. That at the beginning of the book, Shesheshen is like, someday I'm gonna find somebody and lay my eggs in them just like my mom did in my dad. It's gonna be great. And over the course of the book, being like, how could I ever do that to her? Like, especially not to her. That's not what love is. The taking from others might not be the actual thrust or meaning of love. And yeah, so it's wrestling with the nature, and it's wrestling with having told yourself your whole life you have enough because it's dangerous to reach for anything more and to open up to other people, which is what drives me as a reader and as a writer. Any story that is a call to me to have greater empathy makes me either want to write or want to read further. These two characters might have having this unusual thing in common. They both grow up under the strange shadows of mothers that are almost mirror opposites of each other. Because Shesheshen, our monster, her first memories are, I was born and mom was hunted down. And so to her mom is her role model. She was monstrous, she was strong, and she did not stop fighting until they came for her. And so she will be this apex predator, and she will be bold and alone. That civilization is the dangerous thing against which mom fought, that I am. I want to be that. It is defining yourself by the absence of a person, the memory of a person. Whereas Homily has a totally different experience. So We think that she is without pain, but she's far from it, that she's actually running from a family of politicians and abusers and barons who see in her the option for obedience and to be used on in marriage schemes that will expand their territories. And she is clearly a lesser favored daughter out of the family. And that has left her with trauma and self-esteem issues that Shesheshen simply cannot fathom. Like, why would you not be in love with yourself? You're amazing. And it's that wanting something better for somebody else, but you can't force someone else to feel differently about themselves, but you can hope to coax that. And so it's this gentle emotional balance through which you could see some people would be like, okay, that's a romance. And other people would look at, let's say, some of the door. That Shesheshen is like, if they would just all look one the other way for 1 minute, I could eat her mom and this would be fine. And you would say it's a horror story or a comedy story. Because all of those elements come out of humanity. The humanities summon us to write strange, bizarre, sometimes wonderful things. Shesheshen herself was the result of a lot of accidental research. I have a fascination with biology. I am not a professional scientist, but I have always thought physics and biology were amazing, that we could come to understand things about not just the human condition, but like the mammalian condition, or even just life as it goes. If you ever look through a microscope at a protozoa or a monera, there's single cell or pre-single cell things from which it seems all life on Earth sprang. It's amazing. It's like that little fighter down there with just a little flagellum, not even a tail, trying to whip itself through fluid. And that is an experience. It doesn't have brain matter, it doesn't have a brain, it probably doesn't have self-awareness or a mind, but there's an experience there. And that's interesting. And every different creature on this earth gives you an opportunity to think differently about how you could experience life. Whether it's like, the idea that like the slime mold, which is like a gross thing you'd rather not think about ever, last billion years it hasn't had to evolve. It figured its lane out really early. And that's amazing. And similarly, the shapes of slime that a slime mold can form, that it can adapt to different environments, different temperatures. And that sort of her ability is there on the genetic level all the way up to something like the octopus, which is one of my favorite creatures. One of my favorite books in recent years, some of you have probably read Cy Montgomery's Soul of an Octopus. Just absolutely fascinating book, including the idea of like brain matter grows through the tentacles of the octopus, such that it's not merely thinking with its center where the eyes are. That's really hard to grasp because this is where we keep our thoughts. The idea that our feelings, that our emotions could be in our limbs is totally challenging. And yet it's also really attractive and liberating to think about how we would be if we were different, because so many of us are already different. And we say that this is what unites us as human. But there are plenty of human beings who cannot read, plenty of human beings who can't write, who can't speak, or who are nonverbal, prefer not to speak. There are plenty of deaf humans who can't hear. Their phenotype differs, and they number, I believe the last time I looked, at 1.5 billion human beings on the planet are disabled who experience the world in some different way. I myself am a disabled author. I bring to you a homunculus of disabilities. This is where Shesheshen came from, is that I myself have various conditions. And I find different ways of living fascinating, because if you're in any disability community, whether it's in person or online, you're being invited to see how different somebody else has it. Because not everybody in a disability community is deaf. Not everybody in a disability community is paraplegic. But you can compare notes. You can be like, I didn't think about bodies doing that because I'm so preoccupied with like losing my hearing, with having chronic pain, with being neurodivergent, that I never thought about what it would be like to rely on this assistive device or to have this condition. That humanity reshapes to fill the form. And I think a lot of great writers have dug into that over time and compelled me. Like I'm hardly the first disabled fantasy writer, and I've hardly created like the first fantasy disabled characters. I'm part of a tradition. Even in Game of Thrones, when Tyrion Lannister is a little And he's like one of the best characters, I think most people would agree, both in the book, and then Peter Dinklage's performance in the show, of course, legendary, and deservedly so. But it is very interesting to think about how different people would fill a speculative fiction world, a fantasy world. You know, we think about the fantasy world, and we imagine everybody would have the same experience of it, except maybe the royals, right? And then we say, all right, our protagonist will be a royal so that they can experience everything. But it's not so. We have different experiences of this world. And so what is the less spoken of experience of any given fantasy world? What is Gollum's experience of Lord of the Rings? We had glimpses of it and some of the most powerful stuff in Tolkien. And similarly, when I sat down to write, I wanted to write about how a monster feels about all these monster hunters. You know, The Witcher I really enjoy the short stories. I've only read the first novel, and it's really interesting, really true stuff. One of the things that I like about Andrzej Sapkowski's fiction is often his Witcher has a sympathy for the monster. It's like, look, I know the people in the town are just annoying. I'll try to help them out. I'll try to get you out of here. But we don't get stories told explicitly from their point of view. They need to be solved by somebody else. And so I come from this, I guess you could say, tradition. I remember as a disabled kid who had mobility issues and chronic pain issues as a teenager, I read The Hobbit for the first time. And yeah, that's a formative book for a lot of people. And it's funny, but my favorite character was Smaug, the dragon. Because as a kid who was in too much pain to leave his room a lot of the time, I was like, the dragon who never wants to go out gets really mad if you come in. I'm like, I get it. He's a disabled dragon. And then he does have a teenager rage fit at the end of that book, which I also found very sympathetic. And I think that's the first time I had that I could fix him feeling as a writer, which didn't turn out to be the writer urge. At the same time, you look at bold writers like John Gardner, who was mostly a literary fiction writer, but who wrote Grendel. The idea of what if the first monster in Beowulf, that classic poem, had an internal life? That's fascinating because no retelling of Beowulf had ever cared about those creatures. It's all about the heroism of somebody who could stand up to the Indian. What is it like to be treated as Indian? Gardner asked that question, and unfortunately, it got to me at a young age, and it really shifted some things for me. It's like, that's right, that's the stuff that I like. I always thought villains seemed interesting, but they don't have internal lives. Maybe with internal lives, they don't have to be villains. Maybe they can be understood. Maybe they can be integrated. Community can. And so, I feel like in companionship with Grendel, even though it's seldom shown near it, is Madeline Miller's Circe, which is a beautiful novel retelling the various myths in which the witch or goddess or creature known as Circe has woven through. And Miller, with great scholarly acumen, threads them through the emotional development of an immortal person and how much is weighing on her. And gave her just an enormous, compassionate internal life that is the sort of thing you can see why so many people have done Greek myth retelling since then. There were always Greek myth retellings, but there's now this boom of feminist retellings of Greek mythology because there's so much to be said about Atalanta or Electra or Ariadne. There are now, I think, 2 books about Medusa coming out soon. And why not, really? She's got a lot to get out of her hair. And then I think about there's a spectrum of light and darkness or heaviness and lightness within stories that can be about creatures. So Stephen Graham Jones is one of the great contemporary horror writers. But for some reason, some wonderful reason, he wrote one very lighthearted book called Mongols, which is about this boy in a nomadic tribe of werewolves who hasn't turned yet. And he's really worried that he won't turn because then he'll be kicked out of the tribe. And it's so cute, it's so sweet. And you really want him to be a werewolf. And at the same time, you're like, please don't be so that you can go out and be more than they think. And you don't know which one he wants, nor you don't know which one you want. But it's got a sweet core to it. And it's a take on werewolves that I've never considered, but it is very emotional and very internal. And I'd say at the opposite end of the spectrum, although still deeply and profoundly engaging with humanity, is someone like John Wiswell Let the Right One In, which is probably my favorite vampire. That uses the lens of the relationship between a vampire and a familiar vampire is the master, the familiar does their bidding. It uses that as a lens to look through the human need for companionship. What is it to be an outcast in society and have nowhere else to turn, but a vampire seems to care about? Would you be attracted? Would you be interested? And on the one hand, you have the story of a vampire who's lost her familiar. And on the other hand, the story of a boy who has no protection in a very dangerous world. And both of them feel very human. And you can tell how both of them need someone else, not just to protect them, but to be there for them. It's a very violent book. It's very, very grim, and it's quite bleak. But it still understands that even in the darkest times, people desire companionship. People desire to be with someone else. And so it's those authors, it's those kinds of stories and those traditions that I feel like I sort of have written into for many years. Before several of these books were published, I was writing short fiction about things from different points of view. So like my breakout story was Open House on Haunted Hill, W. Award, which is literally a short story told from the point of view of a haunted house that just promises it will behave if you will please live in it. I know I scare the bejesus out of everybody, but it's very lovely. And I've just always been attracted to these lenses to look at humanity through, because we don't always get to the truth of humanity in depicting pure human love. And so Veronica Roth put it this way, that she feels fantasy is the language of exaggeration, finding truth through something that's embellished. That in fighting with a dragon, you come to understand something about the real world that you couldn't by merely talking about the real world. I think Roth was onto something there. I myself still wrestled with it. Sometimes it's merely great fodder to spotlight some weird foible about our preconceptions, our biases. So one time I wrote a short story called The Tyrant Lizard and Her Plus One, which is about a deaf security guard on an island full of dinosaurs, and she realizes she's being stalked by an apex predator, who just also happens to be deaf. And she never thought about a deaf dinosaur before. So the deaf human and the deaf dinosaur finding a really weird bond between each other, which is super fun. And it's actually now been adapted into audio like multiple times. And I made my protagonist very opinionated. She's like a very cantankerous security guard and super annoyed that this dinosaur won't leave her alone up until she realizes we have this thing in common. But that disability could not just be a human thing that exists within communities. Who wants to have petted a very good three-legged dog? You are missing out. I'd say internet. I recommend it heavily. But all these years of writing these different creatures, I think, with building up to being able to write this story, which does not mean that I've outgrown the short story. I just finished one last night. I continue to love the short form, but there was something more robust that I needed to develop in my style. So like earlier, we had a question about writing process. And I think one of the things I needed to unlock in my writing process that comes at different points for different writers is what captivates me, what would make me want to come to the keyboard over and over again. And for me, is finding a character with a voice and a context that I want to know more about. I want to see how it changes. I once upon a time was fascinated with static status quos. You know, I grew up on mythology. And Zeus is just going to be Zeus forever. He refuses to learn. It doesn't matter how many times things go wrong and Hera catches him. He will continue to be a dirtbag. And that can be fascinating. But sitting with a character that everybody thinks can't change, and then plotting the arc in which they might actually change, that speaks to the human possibility. That I find really fascinating. I think it's a huge part of my process. I also, there was a great writer, the name was Dr. Samuel Johnson, who would recommend you would write as much as you can up till the middle of the scene. And that's where you can stop for the day, because then tomorrow you know what you have to write. Never stop your chapter, never stop at the end of a chapter, because then you have to come up with something else tomorrow. Make good on it tomorrow. And I found that is that useful. I also find a lot of writers will work on word count. And That's good at a certain level of training that you want to write. I'm gonna write 500 words a day, 1,000 words a day. It's NaNoWriMo, we're gonna try to do 1,800 words a day or something like that. And that can be good, I've done that, but I find I write more words in general if I just go by plot beat. Today is the day where Frodo and Sam leave the Shire. Today is the day where I'm gonna write up until this fight scene, up until the revelation about his parents. And what I then do is I am following the plot, the character, the humanity in the situation, up to where it hits a good stopping point that is pregnant with possibilities for what comes next. And I usually have an outline, so even though I'm writing up to here, I do have an idea of where it needs to go next. But that's a huge chunk of my process. I would just say, since we're on the half hour, I'm going to try to pause in case there are questions. We can, of course, continue. But this thing about monstrosity is shapeshifting, which is the essence of Shesheshen. Building your body out of unwanted parts came from seeing how easy shapeshifting was for most characters in fiction. And I like those characters, don't get me wrong, it is, but it means something different. To have something like Bram Stoker's Dracula, who he can be a bat, he can be a fog, he can become fog or mist. He'll be a wolf outside, or you'll see a wolf outside, and you'll know he turned into that. It's a thing of complete convenience and power, which works for an antagonist. It's different when you need to sympathize with the character. I think about the misery and the weight that rests on a character. Something like Indra Das, a great Indian author, wrote a novel about the strange hidden lives of werewolves called The Devourers. Beautiful literary novel. He's a fantastic writer, but none of it is easy, including the socialization, the guardedness everyone needs to have. And I would vacillate between those things. Like I grew up as a fan of the X-Men, so like I like Mystique, the blue lady who can look like anything, but in her downtime, she's blue because like that's work. This is who I am. And I always like that there's a true sense of identity that you get to build for yourself. But I wanted to play more with the presentation. The Shesheshen's great burden for a huge chunk of the novel is shapeshifting a body that will look normal. How do I present myself as though I'm normal so that nobody will hurt me? Which comes from many angles, because many different walks of life require passing. With disability, whenever I'm in a city, I am actively trying to hide any tremors or stumbles, because if I look disabled, I'm more likely to be singled out. Similarly, queer people have often tried to pass as straight to be safer in groups where they're not sure that they are able to be vulnerable. And that was inherent in Shesheshen, in the notion of Shesheshen presenting herself outward. That this is a labor, that humans are exhausting. Her neurodivergence comes out very, very heavily in all of the trying to present as normal. Because another huge passing thing is, don't let people know you're crazy, don't let people know you're crazy. Which is something that I've is to try to signal to others that like, I'm someone you can just leave alone. Please don't pay dangerous attention. And so it was fun to play with a form of shapeshifting that was not easy, that she can't generate bones. So she's like, this steel chain has been a really good spine for the last 5 years, and I'm keeping it. Every year when I exit hibernation, I put that steel chain inside of my back, and it feels pretty good. Legs I can do better with. And playing with, like she has this scene where nobody will dance with calmly. So she goes out and she goes to the local butcher store and is picking out the right bones for dancing feet. It is at once gruesome and wholesome, right? It's something that's human, it's something that's odd, it's abstraction that reflects the ways we try to present ourselves, sometimes to be there for another person. It's not always safety. It's also about trying to put on a better face or be the person someone else needs. And that's a huge burden for her, of course, that she doesn't know how to do this. She is making it up on the fly as she's making up her body. But that's just a aspect of monstrosity that I never thought about, because so many human characters over time, the Jack Torrance of The Shining, are monstrous, are human beings broadcasting monstrousness. There isn't, I think, enough people who think they're monstrous trying to broadcast their humanity. I think that reflects differently on us. It shows us our possibilities, and that if you've been outside, if you felt unwanted, that doesn't mean you actually belong outside. That maybe you belong inside. And that's why the book was, the dedication of the book was to anyone who's been made to feel monstrous. Because a lot of readers, a lot of people deserve better. So that, that's the journey of this book. Were there any questions in the chat? Because we are split between this audience and the internet.
Don't see any yet, but feel free to put any questions in the chat.
All right. You'll pardon me as I have a sip of water. Please, anyone at home, feel free to ask a question. And if anybody in the audience here would like to ask anything, please.
So it sounds like your writing process, you have a pretty good idea of where the story is going. You're not making it up as you have a general sense of where you're going to end up, but you are, still creating as you go along.
Yes, I would say so. I tend to write with an outline that's no longer than one page. The outline for this novel was about half a page long of just bullet points. So this needs to happen, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. I know that I write better with a goal, but I also know that I will get tired of an idea if I think it out too much in advance. So I've gotten the juice out. It's like being asked to eat orange pulp once it's already been turned into orange juice. You don't really want the rind. So what I do is I give myself direction. I know where I want things to build up to in the short term, and then a vaguer sense in the long term. It's good to have a placeholder ending. They'll destroy the ring somehow. Like you can just put that at the end of Lord of the Rings. Tolkien had a better idea than that. But placeholder ending. And then as I write, everything else I'm making up along the way. I know these two characters need to be at the dance by this hour, and everybody's trying to keep them apart. So I'll write how they try to circumvent that and get together. But the writing of that is making that up. That's the play, but it's play that fills in the skeleton. That's why I keep calling it plot skeleton, is the prose, the storytelling is the connective tissue, but the skeleton of the story, the good bones of a good story, those let the thing move. It can't operate without it. Similarly, I turned my second book into the publisher recently, and I think the outline for that was 3/4 of one page. And I'm sometimes tempted to publish or just on my blog or in a newsletter or something. Here is the outline that became that 300-page book, just so people could see. Because a lot of the process gets mystified. And that's why I like it when people ask process questions, because I think we're all better off the more we know about how it works for other people, because it works so differently for different writers. Right, you get those people who just on their lunch break every day, 45 minutes, and just go. And then as soon as the lunch break's over, they go back to work. And then you have other people like a James Joyce, who would write 2 sentences in one afternoon and not be sure which one comes first. It's just that huge diversity and difference. Joyce is my go-to for struggling with writer's block. And again, you see what Joyce wrote, and you can see how somebody could get blocked. That's very complex, chewy, difficult syntax, let alone plotting an internal life. So it's different stories also require different structure, or different structure for the author. It can be similar structure, especially in a skeletal list.
I have a question.
Yes, Brent.
So, once the book is, the manuscript is finished, and you are pleased with it, or you have other people look at it, then you decide, okay, now the next step is to send it out. do you use an agent? Did you do it on your own? I know you were writing short stories before this. So you had basically a portfolio, I guess. But if you were this was your first effort and no short stories before, how would you do that?
It's a very interesting question of how, especially if I'd go about it today if I was just starting today. I wrote a lot of short stories because I love writing short stories. I didn't write them to try to sell a novel. In most cases, a short story portfolio doesn't help you. Now I won some awards, like I won the Nebula Award, I won the Locus Award. And I've been a finalist for the Hugo, the World Fantasy, and the British Fantasy Award. So like, I have a portfolio of award-nominated and award-winning fiction that did help a little bit. And then like agents who previously would not recognize me, did recognize me at the bar at that. But it will not sell a book on its own. They need to receive a book that they find interesting. Now, if I were to start today, I think it's a very interesting question of where to start, because there isn't the one right answer. Self-publishing is fraught right now. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but like right now, so many LLM and AI programs are flooding Kindle with auto-generated books that are basically scams. And it's made it harder on self-published authors than before. There are still people making a living and producing interesting art in the self-published sphere. It's just more challenging to garner visibility because market controllers like Amazon are not doing nearly enough work to help. Human authors get visibility over things that are being gained. At the same time, like it is not easy to break into publishing. In fact, this was not my first novel. It was just the first novel the publisher wanted. I wrote 7 books before this one, I think. I think 7 complete books. And I don't regret any of them. You know, like, did I want to publish them? Yes. But they made me the writer I am now. I discovered my process in writing them. I'm proud. They taught me a lot of things, not just about myself, but about the way that like fiction can work, how voice can work. And that's not a waste of time. Any project that teaches you about writing is probably worth it because you'll become a skilled enough writer that you can potentially eventually hit that idea out of the park. It's really not the idea so much as the skill of the writer who has the idea. There are plenty of stories that are just not really that interesting if divorced from their voice, their characterization, from their lens on humanity. Like Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, where the guy's just bellyaching about his toothache for like 100 pages. Good luck making anyone want to read that, but that's a classic piece of literature because it is execution-like. I think that's Dostoevsky. I'm sorry if I had that. The gods are shaming me for my failure of Russian literature comedy. So I have an agent. I went the agent route. If you want to be traditionally published, you probably need an agent unless you submit through a program like Orbit Books has an imprint for authors without agents. I don't know how well that's been vetted. It does seem like some people are having a good time with that program, but generally, the process is you write your novel, you write a query letter that's like, hey, I wrote a cool novel, you might like it, and then you send it to agents. I had been in the industry long enough that I knew the agents who represented the authors I respected. And so I made a list of like, who is R.F. Kuang's agent, who's Stephen King's agent, who's Margaret Atwood's agent, and then went through, okay, who within their portfolios, you look up that agent, okay, she represents this guy and this guy who I'm kind of in the same vein as. That might be an agent who could get what I'm trying to do. And so that person gets to the top of the list. Now, ironically, my agent, Anna Bowman, who I adore, she works at the Life of Dawson agency. She rejected my previous 2 books. And she, both times would add a note on the rejection. If this doesn't sell, please send me your next one. And you will get that kind of note on a lot of things. And it's very easy as a beginning writer being like, your hopes are dashed because this book didn't sell. My life is ruined. Whereas actually it's just, you made one commercial product in your life of being an artist tomorrow the sun will rise and the keyboard will still be there. You know, you have more, and trust me, you have more stories in you. If you're like struggling with that one book, I gotta tell you, you contain more inside of you than this library contains. Because the human mind and spirit and experience is more complex. Books are an expression of different parts of ourselves. You have more stories to tell. It may be that you'll come back to this story that's being rejected now someday with greater skill and retell it and make it work. Isaac Asimov famously did that many, many times. He leveled up his game to the point where he could go back to that story I didn't work and now nail it. Today stings, but tomorrow is another opportunity. So anyway, and then, I sent this book to Hannah, and a few other agents also really liked the book, and there was a bit of a fight over it, which, you know, felt nice. After years of not catching a car, having several cars argue over you is actually kind of nice. Then the process from there, once I had an agent, is that we put together a submissions package to send to traditional publishers. And some publishers were already interested because I had talked to an editor about the book at a dinner sometime, right? And she was like, that sounds interesting. Send that to me. And then other editors or other publishers that just simply carry the kind of books that I wanted to go alongside, or that had similar vibe to my work. And then, you know, some publishers put forth bids to buy it, and many of them just turned it down or rejected. You know, this book has been wonderfully successful. But it is worth saying, like, if you've heard of this book, if you like this book, if you think this book is a surefire success, a bunch of editors disagreed with you back then. That just happens because nobody knows, right? And it's very easy to get like any kind of rejection, whether it's from an agent, whether it's from a magazine for a short story or an article, whether it's from an editor at a major publishing house, to be like, my career is doomed. And it's just not so, in part because that rejection doesn't mean you're a bad writer. It just meant that thing wasn't a fit with that person at that time on their book list within the financial constraints they've been given by their overhead. It's a weird industry in which to try to give human connection to people. It's an interesting adventure. And Daw really believed in this book. And I felt blessed to work with a bunch of the people there on this. And to see just how many people have connected with. Every piece of fan art that I get sent is just a joy. It like brightens my entire day. Especially because Shesheshen is perfect for fan art, not to like pat myself on the back, but because she's had like 8,000 different forms across the book. People pick very different versions of her to draw, and so no two fan arts look the same. I love you. Thank you. But you don't, then just to come back to you, even once you have an agent, you don't know that first book would sell. When I talked to my agent about when at the time when she was a prospective agent, I said, like, well, what do we do if this book doesn't sell? She was, sell the next one. You know, you just expect that you will write another thing. So the quote unquote failure or rejection is baked into the thought process down to that level. It's just, you're always going to assume that something you create that's very meaningful to you might not be right for this moment for someone else. Does not invalidate you in any way. It may feel that way. If you're rejection sensitive, I certainly am, to some of you probably are. It's just part of the cost of doing business. I hope you can just be gentle to yourselves. And remember that like authors like Stephen King, who are bigger than the genres they write in, have a bunch of trunk novels they couldn't sell even when they got all the famous. And like a bunch of the books that I've written, I can't imagine ever wanting to be published now. Like they were stepping stones to getting to this level and getting to tell these stories. There are a couple I might revisit, but they really are just worthwhile experiences. So that's a long explanation about the process of getting something published.
Yeah, wasn't Stephen King, I think his first novel was rejected, wasn't it? Was it?
I'm pretty sure, what I know for sure is Stephen King got so many short story rejections that he started putting them on a nail in his wall. And he got so many, he needed a new nail. And that's famous. That's from his own writing, which is a lovely book about it.
So, and online says that he was rejected 22 times.
Way too tough. Which book was that, if they said?
You know which one?
I mean, was his first book Carrie?
Harry.
It was Carrie, okay. Oh, there we go. I've done a very good job of not being distracted by that screen. But to the detriment of Dennis's input, thank you, Dennis, yes. And that's funny too, because I don't know about you folks, I found Carrie profoundly moving when I read it as like a teenager. The idea that people wouldn't want that book is like boggling to my mind. Feel that way about your own work. Remember that can be that for others.
I would think that, it must be very hard for a writer. If you put everything into this and then you get a rejection letter, I think you have to have a very strong inner strength to continue to believe in yourself. That would be how, I think I would just say, oh, that's it for me now. I'm gonna go out and see trenches or something.
Yeah, it absolutely can be brutal. And to go back to James Joyce again, like his life was terrifying in a creative sense, that he really thought on many days before Ulysses was published that his career was over. And to think that, he wrote something that's this indelible classic that's in every college library. But he thought it was it because he couldn't get it to come out on the page the way he wanted, that he couldn't organize his thoughts correctly. I think it should humble us. If you know the famous giant struggle, it can soothe some of it. I also say community can be incredibly helpful. In the age of social media, I live alone in the woods, right? And I don't have many local writer friends. I do love local writers, don't get me wrong, but most of my writer friends are in Greece, Australia, Japan. I have a couple of friends serving in the Ukrainian war right now, who I met through writing. And one of them is still sending me poems. He's a cool guy. I almost said no, but he's a heck of a piece of work. I really like him. I really admire him. And you can connect through various social media platforms, various websites, and just look for people who are open to mutual support, who aren't just there to be supported, to be held up, who are willing to beta read for you, or the process of reading an early draft and help you, guide you to where you want it to be. Which, by the way, that's the key, that's the linchpin of feedback. If somebody says they hate your story, that can hurt. But like, why did they hate it? Does their hatred affect how you are trying to get something across? Because it might be that it's irrelevant. And that's okay. No literature is for everybody. Like, we've got this wonderful library here. No book out there is loved by every single patron. That's why you need a diversity. That's why you need multiple rows of books. That's why you throw your microphone across there. I find commiserating and supporting and celebrating fellow authors to be enormously helpful. I was not the first person in my writers group to sell a book, but I was ecstatic for my first friends who sold books. And I was like so psyched when I could be like the first person they told this whole story to a big magazine. Like Uncanny Magazine and Strange Horizons are two of my favorite magazines. And I've actually never sold to Strange Horizons, but I've sold to Uncanny. But many of my friends got into those places first, and I was just psyched for them. And you want to prop people up both when they struggle, but then also when they succeed. I think that's the friendship, the alliance of authors. I find that community invaluable.
Dennis online has a related question about how do you find beta readers? Is it easier now that you're published?
It is certainly easier now, although not because I'm published, but because I've been around so long that I've met a ton of people. I know a lot of writers because I've been talking to writers for so long. This will sound like bog standard advice, but I try to just treat everybody like they're equally important. And so some people I met 10 years ago run major magazines and are editors at major publishers. And some of them are still struggling to like sell a story every year, or even if that. And none of those people are more important than each other. They may have more success in a career, but if you treat people with decency, they tend to remember that. And so over time, I've had an easier time getting beta readers for specific things, simply because I've built up this network of friends who might have a different expertise. You know, if I write a disability that's outside of my wheelhouse, and I know a disabled writer with that disability, I might contact them to take a look at it. So it is mostly easier, not because I'm public, but because I've been around long enough that I've met a lot of people. And I know that's daunting. The advice, meet more people, isn't that like that, that's not your favorite advice you've ever heard, of course. I will say, I have, because I've been around long enough and I've had some success, it is easier to meet some people. I am more receptive to people who would have met me anyway. People who are interested in what I call flattening the hierarchy, to just try to meet people with these. It's awesome that my story moved you, but you as a human being aren't worth any less than me just because like I sold a book. That's a thing I even did. It doesn't mean that I deserve more dignity or like people should, I don't know. But I am about the flattening of hierarchies when I can be. I think if you publish a story and people really like it, or anybody really likes it, it can be worth staying in touch with that person, especially when you're early on. Because they might, you know, if you're looking for beta readers, that person might be a good beta reader for you later. And you might be a good beta reader for them if they're interested in that sort of thing. Because they already jive with what you're making. Or at least one of the things you made. It may be that you'll make very different things later that don't jive with them, in which case you should just navigate that carefully. Similarly, a lot of my beta reading contacts early on in my first like 5 or 8 years of my career came from, I read people's stories, liked them, and told them that. And then we just had conversations about like, how did you come up with this? We're like, where did you get this kind of expertise? Or like, what was the inspiration for this? Which is just questions I was generally interested in, because I'm a writer who was interested in how another writer made something so incredible. And sometimes people don't want to have a conversation with you, in which case, leave them alone. But if they are receptive, if they do think it's fun, to talk about craft, then have that conversation, and maybe you two can stay in touch. Oh, and that is much easier now with social media, that you can comment on somebody's Twitter or Blue Sky or Facebook, like they posted the link and then you commented like, I love the story, thank you for writing it. So it's easier to do that now. And if I like a story by an author I don't know, which happens all the time, I will generally Google them to see where they are on social media, just to tell them. And it's not because I want them to be a beta reader. Honestly, it's just I want them to know they had a positive effect with their writing, because we all feel more alone in our writing than we actually are. And that sort of goodwill, I feel like, can go a very long way. Not in exchange for beta reading. It can be, but just in exchange for community, that you will stick around. You'll have literary friends who will have different tastes or similar tastes. You can challenge each other, you can grow together. And I don't know, that's my favorite thing about social media with regards to writing and reading. You couldn't just leave a message on Edgar Allan Poe's Facebook page and tell him it's good. Hang in there, Ed. You couldn't do that back then. But yes, so I hope that is useful to us. Yeah. Okay, I got a while out of that, so I know I did my job.
Any more questions?
All right, and we have come up on just about the hour, so.
So, yeah, thank you very much, John. It's been great. Really appreciate your coming, and I wish you much luck on your next book. Let us know when it's out.
Oh, yeah.